All right, so hey there. So today we are going to be going over how to do a black and white painting off of a color reference. Now, my reference today, I'm actually going to be using this really pretty red apple picture. I'm going to recreate at least the feeling of this and this canvas here. And this is just a regular canvas board, nothing special. So we're doing this in black and white today. So I'm only using black and white on my little butcher tray here. I love this butcher tray because even in the case that I mess it up, so long as you get it wet and maybe let it soak overnight, the paint comes right off of it and you don't have to worry about ruining something. It's a lot easier to use than like something disposable, like a paper plate totally does work, but you're throwing away a lot of trash, and this way I'm not doing that. Now the colors I'm using today again are just black and white. I'm using Liquitex Basics, but any starter paint will work for this. Now usually when I paint, I don't necessarily use Liquitex Basics. I use a Liquitex heavy body paint that I can water down, or if I'm looking for a watered down paint, I'll just use straight gesso to lighten stuff up because it's a very sheer color. But for this, because Liquitex Basics is found pretty much everywhere and it's cheap, we're going to use that. Now brushes today, we're going to be using, this is a 1-inch flat brush. This is meant for just covering a lot of space really fast. I've also got, this is a 1/2-inch brush here. It's a nice long one there. I'm also using, this is a small angled shader. Now this one I might not necessarily need. I do want to make sure it's got an angle to it, so that way for things like the little soft highlights and everything, I can buff those in. But you don't necessarily need to have these brushes. They're fun to have, but it's like an optional thing. And I'm also have a tiny little liner here. It's just like a small little pointy brush. So I can do things like the smaller little details without too much hassle. Now, so when we start with this, the first thing I'm going to do is ignore the fact that there is an apple in front of it, and I am just going to work on the background. Now, if you do want, you can take a pencil, kicking my stuff, you can take a pencil and give a quick gesture around with where you want stuff to be. But for something this simple, I don't think I necessarily have to draw it. So instead, I'm just going to go right on with paint and then maybe use chalk or something if I absolutely need to get something in space. But this is such a simple shape that it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to get my brush just a tiny bit wet. This helps the paint smear around a little bit, but remember, we're using Liquitex Basics, not the heavy body stuff, so you can't over mix it too much. And the first thing I'm going to be going for is this background here. Now, this has a shelf at the bottom, and then there's this darker stuff on top. Now, this is how I tend to mix with paint. I tend to squish into the paint to load it. That way, I'm not getting like a giant angry glob. Usually when people go straight down, all of this glob happens here, and that's just way too hard to work with. So I kind of squish it off, get as much off as I can. I can always go back for more paint. Then get a little bit of black, and this squishing technique also gives me sort of like a sample size of what my color is going to be, and I'm going for like a medium to dark gray. And I'm not worried about matching every single color right away. I'm just worrying about getting that initial line down. This line here is going to be going from over here down to about there. So I'm going to slice it in half. And I can always go back over again if it's not 100% copacetic there, just to get a nice diagonal slashy here. Now my paper, or my canvas here, is a little more, it's a little taller than the picture that I'm working with. So I'm playing around with it until I get a composition that I like, and this one will work. And now I'm just going to make this not white. I'm just going to slap some of that gray on there and then worry about trying to necessarily like match every single thing. Because the very background, not the tabletop, is the furthest away. I'm more worried about covering this right now, not really worried that much about anything else. Just painty, painty, painty. Like, I'm not worried about the tabletop right now. I'm not even that worried about this line here, because even if it's not perfectly straight, it doesn't matter. You're going to paint over it anyway. Now, as I'm doing this, I am pulling more white, more black together, but I'm not really measuring it. I don't want to mix it like perfectly, because you'll end up with one solid color like you're painting a wall, and we don't want that. Painty, painty, painty. Now, it gets darker over in this section here, but I want it to lighten up a little bit more as it gets to this corner. But this line still has to remain darker. You're not going to get that that contrast between the shelf and the actual background. So I'm just adding a little bit of light gray in there, and I'm working pretty fast. And I'm also not just doing stroke, 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 stroke. You'll get the same repeated pattern over and over again. I'm rotating my brush messily in my hand, just really dabbing it on there. Let the brush strokes create some interest in that background. This especially goes with anything that looks a little out of focus in your painting. If you just do very messy blobs of like, oh, there's a dark thing there, so maybe I should do some dark. Well, it's okay, because it's not supposed to be defined. And this is a quick and easy way of getting it just down. Now, I did go a little dark in this section here, and right now I'm kind of playing around with it to correct this if you do end up getting too dark, because mine is just a hint on the dark side. You can take your brush, squeegee off whatever extra you have. I know it's scary. Give it a good angry rinse, and every time I rinse my brush, this is over halfway full. You always want to use a cup that is over 16, 18 ounces. The bigger the better, honestly. You won't have to change your water as much. And every time you dip, you need to go to the bottom of the cup. The friction from the bottom of the cup is really what gets it clean. Nice and clean brush. Now, a good way to tell is if you're dabbing off on a napkin, you shouldn't see any solid color come off of that napkin. If you do, that means that there's still some wet paint stuck in those little crevices, and we don't want that. Now I'm going to get just some, I picked some dirty white, so it's not pure white. And I'm just going to go right over top of that area that I wanted to correct. And because I squeegeed off all that excess, I don't have as much paint to fight against. So little dabs, little dabs, little dabs all over the place until it looks nice and blendy and what I'm looking for. Now, if you want a softer blend instead of just angrily dabbing and you want it to swish a little bit, pretend like you're sweeping a floor. Give it a little swish, swish, swish. I'm starting off the canvas and swishing on, and that'll help pull the colors back and forth. Gives a nice little bristly, brushy look. But your brush strokes will change a little bit. So if you have a preference on one or the other, I like to try and keep with about the same brush stroke whenever I'm doing my background. Just keep it that way. Nice little dabbies, nice little dabbies. So I've got some lights, I've got some darks, and now I'm going to start on my tabletop here. Open up my thingy here. All right, so this tabletop goes pretty light here, and there's some variation in here, but the only really dark spot on there is that shadow right in there. But we're not going to worry about the shadow yet because my apple isn't there. And if my apple's not there, it gets a little to match. If you are awesome and you've got it sketched out and you know exactly where that apple is going, then you can totally just go ahead right to the shadow. But I do not. So I'm going to take the same thing, and the cool thing about black and white painting is I'm just mashing the brush together, not having to mix anything. And this time, I want to use a different brush stroke. I'm using nice long brush strokes instead along the grain of the wood to give it a woody-esque feel. I'm going to make it a little lighter, and I'm staying a little on the light side right now because I can always go darker. And I don't want to lose track of where that line is. And I'm going right up to and on top of where I stopped with my previous paint. Nice and long. The best thing that you can do is do these nice long lines all the way across here. Now, one thing to note here is that as I'm painting, I am staying away, 100% away from anything that is a straight black or a straight white. Even this stuff up here is not straight black. It is a dark gray. Reason being, black and white are your extremes. Those are extreme shadow or absence of light, or extreme, light, which would be our highlight. We've got some of that later on in the middle of that apple there. See that little shiny bit there? So if I spend all my time trying to get this absolutely pure, pristine white tabletop, well, it's not going to look right because I still need to add my highlight on there. And if I've already spent that white on a not highlight thing, it's going to make my apple look a lot less shiny. Or it'll look like it's just a really overexposed picture. Now this, because I'm doing back and forth, I'm getting this, it's a sort of a woody texture, and I'm getting right to the edges with this. I don't care that I'm getting paint on anything. Always paint on something you don't care about. Or at least lay down some paper or something, because you really do want to get to the edges. Even with these canvas boards, it tends to run around the side, and you'll ruin a tabletop really fast. So, another thing. I did notice that my line is a little steep. So what I can do is take my brush, put it right on the paper and sort of align my brush with it and then bring it over here. And I can see, actually, I'm pretty close. So that's honestly probably just because I have way too much canvas for this thin little picture. But that'll work. So looking at my picture, this up here is still too bright. This is all too bright. But now I can go in and add some darker stuff, but I still want it to be brighter than what my background is. Now I could go back around and play with my background, but at this point, everything here has started to dry down. I really don't want to mess with it unless I absolutely have to, because then I have to worry about painting around this tabletop. Now this has some like scratchy type stuff going on with it. And this is where I'm going to take this brush and switch over to, I'm going to dump that one, switch over to my smaller one. We're going to add some little textures and scratches. Same white, same black, just kind of squishing it together to get a medium gray type color. And I'm not trying to be too perfect about this because remember, our main goal here is to do the apple, not necessarily all the background stuff. Now, this is going along with the table slanting this way, which means this going this way is along with the grain. And I'm keeping it a little flat and just making some quick marks. And at first, it's going to look like, oh no, what are you doing? You're not doing anything. Adding a little more black. A little more black. Kind of pulling the color in a little bit to give it that look. Same thing over here. All my lines have to be in about the same direction. And this is just to give it a little extra of like a worn grain type thing. And even with these down here, see all these are going in this direction. All these down here have to be going in about the same direction. They might change a little bit because of perspective, but we're so close to this apple, I don't think you would. Now this isn't all we're doing either. We're going to be doing some in the other direction too. I'm just trying to get these down first because these are the harshest ones. So we've got some marks there. We're going to go back in this direction now. Add the same thing. Little streakies, little streakies. And as I'm working on the wet, sort of pulling the color back and forth a little bit, really giving it a grainy type look. Correcting those a little bit because they're a little messy. And I'm not using a lot of paint here. I'm just kind of making a few marks. Now right now everything's a little on the shiny side, so if it looks a little odd, that's okay. I'm also not worried about getting like final touches down. This is just getting base colors here. I'm also not worried about going too dark. Or I am worried about going too dark. Like, don't get too dark right now. We can always go darker. We're still wanting to remain in these grays. You can add a couple smaller marks out here. And I'm just scoring this top here. The apple's going to go here, so I don't give a crap about anything that goes on over there. And I'm really using this brush to kind of pull the color along back and forth. And just keep going. Now the tabletop has a basic amount of scoring and stippling going on here. Well, not a lot of stippling. By the way, stippling is when you just kind of poke at it, which you can do. You want it to look like a sort of a worn type tabletop. So we're starting to get some more scoring going on here. Now I am going to cross a little bit into where my apple is going to be. I'm trying not to add too much paint to my apple, or my apple area, because I don't want to have to fight with a layer and a half worth of paint every time I go through it. But I do want it to overlap a little bit into where I'm going, or else you'll have this weird halo of unfinished stuff all the way around your apple, and we don't want that. Little marquee. See, we're starting to get, and I'm always going like back and forth, making it look like a really worn type table. This one's a really scratched up table on this one. And worst case, if you ever get to the point where you cannot necessarily replicate something 100%, try to go just for the feel of the thing. So if there's a bunch of brush strokes going this way and then this way, really messily, you'll get the same textured feeling, even if the actual texture isn't absolutely 100%. That said, this one here is actually not looking too shabby right now. Now when I rinse that brush off, I'm also going to be switching back over to my big brush here. And this whole thing is super flippin' wet. Give me a little tap here. But because I'm working on grays, I don't care. I am going to be using a gray that I start with right here. And I'm going for a gray that is about, like, I don't know how well you can see that middle red. Whoop, move the brush. That middle red there is what I'm looking for. Now, I don't want to cheat and just like grayscale it, because like in a Photoshop or whatever. I want to give it just an eyeball, and I'm going to start sketching out really roughly where I want my shape to be. You can always start smaller. So there's a little mark here. Apples aren't necessarily always round. In fact, a lot of times they've got some weird bumps to them. So I'm using the corner of my brush to sketch out where I want this apple to go. Make it down. You can always start at the bottom too if you're a little afraid of like, oh no, I don't want to get my apple off. I actually made this guy a little small, so we're gonna make him a little bigger. Now you can use a smaller brush if you want to. I tend to go with the largest brush that I can while still feeling like I can actually do the thing. I'm just filling this in with whatever grays I have just so you can see the shape. Where was I? Oh yeah, you don't necessarily have to sketch with this massive brush here. But I like to use sort of oversized brushes when I paint because I get a lot faster coverage and a lot less brush strokes. It's less time I have to spend getting a perfect coat, especially when it comes to these cheaper paints. They tend to be a little on the see-through side when you start getting into color. And those can be like multiple coats. And the smaller brush you have, the streakier it is. So I'm just getting a nice, just kind of mashing the paint together until it gets a nice medium-esque gray. And right now, this apple is really super contrasty, and that's what's causing it. So even though this looks like it kind of blends in a little bit with the background, a little too much, we are going to add stuff to it to make it look a little more fancy. Now this is where I am going to switch over to another brush. This is my smaller flat one. This is this little dewdrobby here. And we are going to use a little more white this time. I'm almost never, by the way, pulling from pure white. I'm always pulling from over here. And you can see all these different grays and everything that I'm mixing up here. I'm just kind of squishing into them. Let the two colors meet in the middle. And then if you want, you can always mix right on the portion that you need. So if I need a darker color, I'll go towards the black. If I need a lighter color, I'll go towards the light. Now I'm going to start over here by lightening up this stuff a little bit. And this is why I love flat brushes, because you can get this nice flat look here, or I can turn it to the side and get a nice thin line. I'm not going to get any really defined lines just because this is so wet right now. I'm just worrying about getting the contrast down, the basic contrast. Starting along the top of the apple, going down, going around. And the highlight is all up in this area. So this, I know, is going to need to be lighter. Just kind of blocking out the colors. Doesn't have to be pretty right now. Most of the time when you're painting with acrylics, it actually won't be pretty for a very long time. Now there is a bit of a halo of color along the top. And this is what gives that sunken in middle portion. That middle is actually not that dark, especially since it goes like yellow in there, which that's going to be fun. So I'm actually outlining with this small thin part of my brush where I want that top to be. So you can see like the topper is going to come right out of there. And then use the brush, no additional paint, just kind of mash in that line so it's a little more subtle. You just want a touch lighter up there because there is that little ridge. I also have right now like a pure white halo around everything, and I'm going to go right over it and sort of play that down a little bit. A lot of times I'm just using these short little brush strokes here. This is very Van Gogh-esque of just like jam the color down. Not worried about getting any perfect grays or anything. Now as I start getting over here, I'm going to start pulling more black in and less of the white. And I'm just kind of mashing it along, getting it in those little crevices. And I'm always looking back and forth at my basic, or my reference here. Come on, wake up. There we go. You know, it gets pretty dark down here, so I can always just take like a nice big, or a nice little bit of black. Never go overboard on your black. It's a pain in the butt, destroys things. And I'm just swishing it in there. Swish, 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 going along the shape of the apple. Bend it over here. Now I do have a flat spot on my apple here, so I'm going to bump that out, kind of going outside of my lines a little bit. You don't have to fall in love with your lines. In fact, in painting, as a general rule, try not to fall in love with anything you do, because you can always repaint it, and there'll always be that one time where like, oh no, you messed up, and you need to go back through and repaint a whole flipping area that you thought you were done with like 4 hours ago. And I'm going to take this around so there's a little bit of a dark lip around it. You don't ever want to stop like smack in the middle. You do want it to wrap up and around a little. The light in this one is actually coming from this direction. So that highlight's going to nail right here when we can actually blend stuff into it. Right now it's a little too wet. Now I'm going to take my brush, scrape off any excess I don't want to use just to get all that extra white off. But I don't necessarily have to clean my brush off because I'm still using black and white. And I'm not going for a solid black. I am going to add a little extra dark along that edge. Now I'm taking my brush to the side. I tend to hold my hand when I'm painting a lot and streak down the sides just to get a little darker over there. Now this is still super duper streaky and kind of gooey. So I'm going to show you how to blend out some of that stuff without messing up what you already did. Now I don't have to add any more paint to this. There's plenty of paint on it. So I cleaned off the same brush here, same guy. And I'm going to very lightly just move around the paint. I'm almost going sideways here. I'm just kind of dabbing the two together. Little dabs, little messy dabs. Sometimes you want to pull one away or the other. If one direction's not working, flip it to the other direction. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm picking up paint. You can see there's already a lot of paint on there. So every now and then, I'll give it a little rinse. And I am going to go back through here, all my little brush strokes, going in the direction that I want the apple to go in. And I'm just using a clean brush, nothing on it, kind of pulling it back and forth. Now, you can also do this with a larger brush if you want, which will also give the same thing, but you'll do it in about half the time with less brush strokes. You can see all those little brush strokes there. So this one here, kind of go back and forth. And even when I'm going in the other direction, I'm always like going back and forth and around the object. There's no straight lines going on here. We're getting more of a smooth shape here, which is what we're looking for. And you can see the difference between those two brush strokes. Very lightly. And you can still see there's like a ton of paint on that. Give that a quick clean. Now we're gonna let that have a second or three to dry. I'm gonna switch back over to this guy here and we're gonna drop in that shadow. Dang it, phone, turn on. There we go. So with this, I am going to keep an eye on, I'm using a dark gray, not a straight black here. I'm going to keep an eye on where I want my light to come from, which is here. The shadow is wrapping down around the bottom and off. Maybe a little more around than that. There we go. And all my brush strokes, I still want to use in the same direction of all the other brush strokes. So if I have some going this way, my brush strokes here still have to be going in that direction. Nice and shady stuff. A lot of times if you're worried about clipping in to your apple, start on the inside edge here and pull out. Get that edge nice and clean. We want that edge to be nice and sexy. There we go. All right, now it looks like I've still got like an angry black line there, so we're going to blend that out a little bit. But I'm also going to add a little extra black directly underneath where the apple's actually physically hitting the table. This is the most black area that you have on the entire thing. This would be the straight black areas, but not a lot, just a little bit. Now, because my paint is super duper wet, I am doing a little bit of a tap motion to get the paint to lay on top of all those wet grays so I don't have to stop. You can alternately stop, but I've still got other stuff that I want to do over here. Like I want to blend out some of this. I'm going to start over here, do little swishies again. And I also still want to pull some in this direction too. I have some going in both directions. Pull a little more more grays into there. Now, as you get further away from the actual apple, you are going to get a slighter light, or a slightly lighter shadow here. So I might take a little bit of white, kind of feather it in there. And you can start seeing the texture kind of bleed through because I use the same brush strokes over each shape, even though this is all brand new paint. Now this is also where if you didn't get any true darks, like there's a dent in the table over here. Can you see it? Can you see it? There's a little dent in the table over here. I'm going to add just a little more of the straight blacks in there. Not a ton, like it's still more of like a gray. Just to darken up any spots at the table that I couldn't get dark enough earlier. And honestly, like that darker, quick, just dabbing it on there and letting it run type texture gives that table a little more realism to it, like a little more roughness to it. These dabs, by the way, are done by basically following the same line, but I'm lifting up a little bit. Almost like you're doing a dotted line, but a lot less deliberate. I'm just splatting the color down there. And after a point, once you get really into painting, you start feeling when you can or can't add more texture. Now your apple does not necessarily have to be like this particular with shading or anything like that. The thing that really matters the most is that this edge here is always nice and crisp. If you can see your background through it, well then it doesn't look like a solid object. That needs to be crisp. I could do exactly the same thing and just have a light side and a rounded off dark side, and you would get a cartoony cell shaded look, but it would still technically be okay so long as the silhouette is good and the shadows and the lights are where they're supposed to be. Now we're going to add in, no battery, no. We're going to add in the topper here, the topper right up here, and we're also going to add in a little bit of shadow from the topper in there. So you can see that topper is what we're going for right now. I'm going to be starting with the same thing, like a little medium gray here. Now, if you want to switch brushes, you totally can. I can use this brush for damn near anything, but I understand that some people really need that smaller brush, and this is actually why we brought it out. I'm going to start where it's meeting the bottom part of this little indentation here. I'm not on top of the light stuff, I'm in the dark stuff. Healthy. I'm going to start right here, putting my brush right at the canvas and pulling off in the direction that I want my topper to go. And it does flare out a little bit at the very top. Whoop, I have a stray hair. Occasionally you get stray hairs in your brushes. It's a thing. Especially if you've used a lot of them or if you've manhandled them. So I've got a little topper here. I am actually going to switch to a slightly smaller brush just so I can get that perfect rounded edge here. So you've got like a slightly, it's very hard to see unless you're right on top of it, especially since it's so, everything is so shiny. But there's a little, almost like a bulb there at the very top, and it gets really dark at that point too. It's not black, but it's getting there. You're going to take a little bit of paint, and oh, by the way, same thing with your brushes. If you've got these thin ones here, if you go straight down into the paint, you have an angry, massive glob on your brush, and we don't want that. So every time I load my brushes, I want to give it a little twirl on the side there. If you can't see a point, then you have too much paint on your brush, at least for this point. There are times where you do want to go a little blobby with it, But I would actually suggest, instead of using your nice brushes to do this, if you need a blob thing, you actually save some of your crap brushes, and then you can dab on there if you need to. Making it a little darker on one side. So we're starting to get a little bit of depth in here. And the same thing with, like, inside that little crevice there. It didn't go quite dark enough earlier, so I'm going to flick it in there very gently. Not quite that dark. That's super dark. It's hard to see with all the lights in here. Now, the other problem that I don't like with round brushes is that they don't like pulling color as much. There we go. So I got a little bit bigger, but that's okay. I'm going to let it dry for a second there. Now I'm going to add the shadow in the same way, kind of starting right near the base here and streaking up and off, and I'm using my reference to figure out where that shadow needs to go. But if you don't have a reference and you really want, like, let's say you're doing art for somebody and they really want that shadow to be somewhere perfect, your lighting needs to match where that shadow is going. So if that shadow down here is pointing that direction, that shadow up there should also be pointing in that direction. Now, I'm also going to use this tiny brush here to really get rid of any of this lighter crap that shouldn't be there. Kind of swish it in there. Everything is still very wet. Kind of rounding that edge out a little bit. That was the one that had the dent in it. Looked like I had chewed on an apple. There are a couple, looking at my monitor, there's a couple shines in here that look like they're white, like in particular down here, that there, I promise there isn't any actual white. It does get a little bit lighter at the bottom of the apple right before it hits. So it's okay if you get a little bit of lightness down here, but no straight white should be down here. And a part of that's just my paint super thick and wet everywhere right now. So we have an apple, and I'm not 100% done with it. I want to show you a couple things that we can do. Like, let's say you come back to this apple and you're like, oh yeah, it's an okay apple, but there's no whites in it. Everything is very plain. This is up here, by the way, not white. Like, if you bring it up here, you can see that's more of like a light gray, versus even this, by the way, is not 100% white. This is like kind of just chewed up board at this point. It's a light gray. I'm going to take out my little angled shader, and I'm going to show you what this is. Now I'm going to take this brush and we're going to do something called dry brushing on it. Now this is super wet, so it's not going to be 100% dry brushing. This is sort of like cheater's dry brushing. I'm going to get some white paint on this brush, and I'm getting as much off as I can. Now the cool thing about our these student grade paints is that they're a little on the see-through side if you bring them very light. So you can always go back through and add things like that light spot there by just dabbing in a little more paint off the brush, just dabbing it in there. And I'm using this little part here that it's pushing straight against the canvas, and when it does that, the one side hits and the rest of it barely touches, and it helps blend as you're painting. So I'm going to just adding a little bit of white in there for that yellow section that's in the apple that I am not able to paint because it's in yellow, but it's still a lighter hue. So you still want to have some light gray there. You can get a pretty good buff in with these little pointed brushes. If you don't have a pointed shader or a angled shader like this, you can take a flat brush and a pair of scissors and snip, but make sure it's a long flat brush or you won't have enough to do. I also wouldn't do that to like an amazing brush, because these shaders typically don't last that long. They get jammed in here really fast and hard, and they just, I wouldn't use a new brush for it. This is a great thing to cut up if you've got an older one. Now I'm also going to do the same thing with the very top here, kind of fluffing in a little bit of that lighter stuff that maybe we lost it earlier, maybe it just needed to go lighter. This is a great technique to use, and sorry, it's a pain in the butt to do this because it's got to be straight at the canvas. If I dab like here, I can kind of show you what it looks like. And we're just adding a little bit at a time. And I am using a ridiculously small amount of paint on this brush. You can see that paintbrush barely looks like it's actually got some paint on it. You can see the gray of the bristles right through it. That's how little I'm using. And I'm going to do a little over here, along the top here. And everything's still wet, so if I dab, it should still come off. Little dabbies, little dabbies. You can see the shine of that apple now is starting to come through. This is what I was talking about before. You really don't want to worry about what it looks like in the first 30 seconds. You're not going to see it. This is what you're going for, not that initial, like, oh no, I don't want to stress out too much with it phase. That everyone, when they first start painting, like everyone stresses out about how they are doing on their backgrounds. And like, oh, is this absolutely perfect? Don't get up about it. You want the star of the show, this apple, to be the fancy part. Now I'm adding a little bit of white in here, but I am letting it run completely off my brush because I do want it to get a little lighter right up here, because this is where my highlight's going to go in a minute. I still have my yellow section here though, a little on the brighter side, so I'm just going to add a little more white to that. So that's my section here, my yellow section, and then I've got this lighter stuff, and this is where you can officially use pure white. And I'm just going to go straight in the middle, well, not in the middle, it's off to one side here, but in the middle of that bright spot, and just dab it in. Do some little, there's a very slight drag to my brush as I'm using these, and I'm going to let it get brighter and brighter. Now if this paint is super wet, you're never going to get it pure white. It's just always going to be a light gray, unless you just like have massive glob on it. So build up to it, and keep in mind too that your brush is picking up paint as you put it down. So this one here, I'm going to just use the corner, kind of glob it on there just to get it brighter. So we've got like a bright highlight on there, and it's not a perfect highlight either. Even though apples feel nice and smooth in your hand, they've got little divots and ridges and everything. Now I'm going to take a little bit of that white there, and we're going to go along the very edge of the inside of that stem to brighten that up, because that also gets a highlight. And I am going to stick my face right in the camera because this is a super small move, just to brighten it up a little bit. And you can see just how much that little white helps. Now the same thing goes for if you have any areas of your table that got too dark. Like there's supposed to be a small bit of light showing right through there. You can add that back in. Same thing with like if this table here needed to be a little brighter. Rough little edge strokes here. And I'm skipping around a little bit so that way I'm not focused on any one area too much. And I don't want my tabletop to get white, pure white at all. There's only a few marks here. Notice how little I've gone back for paint. I haven't reloaded my brush since I did that white dot there. Mash it around a little bit. Light baby touches, very light baby touches with this. I actually prefer using any and all angled brushes to a flat brush, or rather, I rather use angled brushes and flat brushes to any round brush. That's what I meant to say. Now you can do that same trick with black. So I'm going to clean this brush off. Nice clean brush. clean brush. The thing is so murdered. And you can totally tell, like if you look straight at it, you can tell that it's, at one point this was a flat brush. It doesn't get flat anymore. This one I tend to mangle my shaders on. And I've got a couple that look worse than this one. I have a habit of not throwing out my brushes. It's a lot easier to have a brush that I don't care about that I can kind of just poke at and murder. So if I need a specific brush that requires me to cut it, I've got some. Now on this side here, I'm going to let that black in here get a little darker because it wasn't quite dark enough, because earlier we still had all that very light stuff. Now there's a little bit of black going up here, and actually I got to drop down my edge just a little bit here so it doesn't look like my apple's falling off the table. This is a weird shaped apple. All apples are weird shaped. I'm going to bring that down here and then down so it looks like it's actually sitting on the table. And now I can muss it up. Now to blend that out a little bit, I'm just going straight into some pre-mixed gray. And what I mean by pre-mixed is, I mean it's from this part here. Got a teeny bit more gray on me. And scrape, scrape, scrape all that extra paint off because we're using as little as possible here. And now I'm going to keep mashing these colors together. And you can see that it's lightening up. And I don't want to end up with anything that's pure black, but it wasn't dark enough earlier. So we're just darkening it down a little bit. When using these angled shaders, be really careful because occasionally paint will gather right up here, right next to the really soft shady bit. And if you press too hard, then you'll end up with a mark that you don't want. Now this has a dark shadow that kind of shinks around this way. This whole section here should be darker according to my my reference. So we're going to add, patting in some black using my dirty brush. Didn't rinse it off. If I use a dirty brush, that means that it's impossible for me to get a straight black. The more you rinse your brush, the more pure color you're going to get. And very rarely in painting do you want to use a 100% pure color from the tube. This is where these shaders are amazing because they are great for mixing paint that's half wet, half dry into itself. And the texture that they create is a very subtle texture. It actually looks more gung-ho on my camera right now than it does in real life. Like right now, this is looking pretty smooth-ish. And a part of that is just my camera is reflecting the wet paint. Get a little more black. This is why I like painting with blacks and whites, because you can just dabby, dabby, dabby. Until we get apple. That was way too light. Now I could sit here and play around with this thing and get it absolutely, totally 100% perfect. But there is one little thing we do want to do with it before I'm done with my apple. They have these tiny little subtle little dots. And I don't want to sit there and just like polka dot with the back of my brush for these, because they will end up, for one, too bright if I use just pure white or pure black, but they will also just be like super in your face and they won't look realistic. So for this, I'm actually using the brush end of my small little pointy brush here. It's small. This one is not that tiny, honestly. Going to get a little bit of this light grayish color, not pure white. But I am going to stay to the lighter end because I want to start, you want to start either with the darker dots, though there's not that many, or the lighter dots, which I know that the lighter dots are around that shade because they're yellow dots. To see the dots, I'm going to see those little dots there. Yeah, we're going to add those. And we want them to be nice and subtle so they're not screaming at us. So I'm just going to take my brush here and just do a little dab, little dab, little dab. And this little texture, this little extra time that you add to it will make or break your painting. So be very careful with it. Some of these I'll go at an angle so they're more of like an oval shape, and some I'll go straight on. Now, as I work towards the darker areas, I should be using slightly darker grays, and they'll be less noticeable, and that's actually what we're going for. Little dab, little dab. These have a little more gray in them. And that's all right if you get some that look a little lighter than they should be. And then you have an apple. Oop, there's still one last little, that's so hard to see with the light. There we go. Better. No, darker. Like that. And there you have an apple. Now this is about as far as I'm going to go with it. So I am going to scribble my name on it. And I like to date my work as well, whenever I'm doing stuff for me. So this is 2019. All right, so a couple things before we wrap up. First off, you should never, ever, 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 ever store your brushes long-term like this. They should never be sitting in the water for longer than it takes you to use them, because the water will soften the adhesives in your brushes and will cause your brush bristles to fall out. They'll also cause them to flare one way or the other, especially if you leave these little pointy guys straight down. They'll bend like flat against the bottom and destroy them. So I typically use a brush cleaner right after them. You also don't ever want to let them sit even dry for the same reasons in your cup. Like, don't store them in the cup, store them flat. And I would honestly leave them out to dry on a flat surface, like either on a towel or something. So that way it's pulling the water out. Also, don't use dish soap if you can help it. The dish soap will work really well to get the brushes clean, but the dish soap will also shorten the lifespan of your brushes. So it's great for a pinch, but not something that I would do 100%. All right, so till next time.